Thanks so much, Adam, for that very kind introduction. And it is so nice to be here in person. So thank you all for coming. And welcome to those of you who are joining from home and live streaming wherever you are in the world. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm deeply interested in the question of why individuals cooperate and what it means to be a social species. And I'm so interested in the question that I wrote a book about it. And that's what I'd like to share with you, some highlights from that book today. So let me share with you my first slide. Do you recognize this scene? Doesn't seem that familiar nowadays. Do you recognize rush hour? Perhaps you might have gone into work late sometimes to try and avoid being in this situation. Well, imagine how different things might look if we weren't so cooperative. If we weren't so cooperative, there would be no trains and no platforms, and maybe people would aggressively shove one another out of the way instead of standing back to let others get on the train. Things would look quite different if we were chimpanzees, a point famously made by the anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy, when she was sat on a transatlantic flight and she wondered, what if I were travelling with a plane load of chimpanzees? Any one of us would be lucky to disembark with all 10 fingers and toes still attached. Bloody earlobes and other appendages would litter the aisles. We're obviously hugely, extraordinarily cooperative, and that's what my book's about. It's about why humans cooperate. But it's also about the other species on this planet that are social and that cooperate as well. And some of the most interesting highlights that I'd like to share with you are why we have grandmothers and why women experience a physiological menopause when no other great apes do. We're going to think about why some ants commit suicide, and what this fish could possibly have in common with Lord Alan Sugar. Now, before we get going, I think it's good to try to be on the same page about what we all think cooperation is, and I'd like this talk to be interactive as well. So I'd like you to get your phones out, whether you're watching at home or whether you're in the audience, anyone can take part in this. And please navigate to the website, www.menti.com. When you get there, you'll be asked for a code, and the code is in red on the screen. So it's 7257-8535. I'll just give you a moment or two to find your way there. Oh, there's free Wi-Fi. Yes, sorry. If you go onto the RI Science Wi-Fi, and I think the password is Cavendish with a capital C. Oh, okay. So yeah, you should find a page that allows you to input what springs to mind for you when you think of the word cooperation. And that word cloud should start to populate as you do that. Okay, what have we got? I can't see it. Business, okay. Sharing, helping, success, tit for tat, altruism, deport, interaction, mutual benefit, exchange. Yep, these are all words that spring to mind when we think of cooperation. Thank you. Okay, so I think in some respects the word cooperation has become synonymous with bland corporate metaphors. Hang on, just let me try and get back to my thing. Oh yes, good. I think cooperation has become synonymous with bland corporate metaphors, evoking images of cheerful teamwork and firm handshakes. And if you go to Google Images and you type in the word cooperation, you're basically going to find a bunch of pictures of people doing, frankly, quite strange things with their hands. Even in the advert for the Royal Institution, this lecture today, I found a nice example. So obviously, cooperation is much more than people doing weird things with their hands. Cooperation involves an individual, or sometimes a gene or a cell, going out of its way to help another individual. And we see many, many examples of cooperation all over the world. This is one particularly poignant example that I'd like to share with you. So this is an ant. It's called Pharelius pusillus, and it lives in very hot, dry regions in Brazil. These ants live in their nest underground. That's where they stay at nighttime. But during the day, they come out and they forage above ground. And when the night falls, they all return back to the nest and they go down the little tunnel and they go to their safe place. But not all of the ants go back underground. A few of them wait at the surface, and they wait for all the other individuals to go back into their nest before they then start to drag and carry grains of sand and other debris to completely conceal the nest entrance from the outside. In doing this, they seal their own fate because the ants at the surface can't survive overnight above ground. But their heroism doesn't end here. So once they've made sure that the nest entrance is concealed and that the colony is safe, those ants at the surface will then turn around and march off into the night to die somewhere else so that their corpse doesn't leave a sign for a predator or another intruder to find the nest. So these ants are clearly an amazing case of altruism. And in this case, we can understand this from an evolutionary perspective because the individuals that sacrifice themselves for their sisters share copies of the same genes. And this act of sacrifice benefits several hundred or maybe thousands of relatives that are protected as a consequence. Cooperation is also a massive part of our own success story. It's the reason that humans have managed not just to survive, but to thrive in every habitat on Earth. But why are we so cooperative? One reason is that evolution demanded it of us. We had to be. This is a picture of a perfectly normal family. And a defining characteristic of human life is that we live in family groups, where mothers receive assistance in raising young from fathers and also potentially from older siblings. This is unusual because none of the other great apes live in family units like this. And in fact, the family in this picture is a bit strange. And I'm not just talking about their fashion choices. The strange thing about this family is that they're an isolated nuclear unit, when for the vast majority of our time on Earth, and also if we look more broadly, cross-culturally, humans lived, and still do live in many cases, in extended family units, where it's not just mum, dad, and the kids, but where mothers are surrounded by several family members and individuals who will potentially help to raise offspring. In this sense, we are really quite different to the other great apes. So if we take a look at the other great apes, what we know is that all of the childcare, all of the rearing of young is done more or less exclusively by the mother. She receives very, very little input from the father or from any other family member. And so in this respect, we really are quite different. But why is that? Why are the other great apes able to manage to raise their offspring alone? And why do humans live in these big groups where we receive so much help in the production of young? Part of the reason lies in the environments in which we evolved. So we know that humans evolved in East Africa in environments that were very hot, very dry, very unpredictable, very difficult. So in environments like this, food is patchily distributed. That means you've got to look for it. It's hard to find. In addition to this, humans have extremely large brains compared to the other great ape species. Our brains are much larger, and brains are really energy-hungry organs. They demand a calorie-rich diet. And for this reason, the part of the human diet, or a significant part of the human diet, is comprised of meat. And we have to work together to either hunt or scavenge to get the meat to feed these onboard computers. Things are quite different for the great apes. For starters, their brains are not so large as human brains. So primate brains are generally large, but ours are significantly larger than any of the other great apes. Gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos primarily subsist on fruit and leaves, and they live in giant salad bowls where this food that they need to eat is just very easily found. And what that means is that it's quite easy for a female to find enough food to sustain herself and to sustain offspring, and she doesn't necessarily need assistance in the production of young. Things were really different for humans. We needed each other to be able to survive, and we needed each other to be able to reproduce. So we're quite different to the other apes, but there are a few other species on this planet that do also live in family groups. So who are they? On this slide, I'm going to show you a few of my favorites. So the guys on the top left basically need no introduction. They are the very famous meerkats of the Kalahari Desert. And anyone who's ever watched Meerkat Manor, maybe, or any wildlife show, there's a good chance you've seen these meerkats on there. The birds next to the meerkats on the top right are probably a bit less familiar to you. They are pied babblers, and they also live in tight-knit family groups in the Kalahari Desert. And in fact, they're the species that I studied for my PhD. Those rather beautiful birds below the babblers are called white-fronted bee-eaters, and they also live in family groups. And then those extremely cute little guys under the meerkats are called Damaraland mole rats. And I've also worked on them, but I have to admit that project was cut short because I had a very strong fear of losing a finger into the teeth of those individuals. So what all these species have in common is that they live in family groups where reproduction is monopolized by a single dominant pair, and everybody else helps to raise the offspring of the dominant pair. Now, the workers or the helpers in these societies are not physiologically sterile. They typically can breed, and sometimes they do try to breed if the opportunity presents itself, but they're often prevented from doing so, either because they can't find unrelated partners to breed with, or because the dominant individuals prevent them from breeding. So, for example, one fact you might not know about those meerkats is that dominant females routinely kill and eat offspring that are born to subordinate females, even when the offspring are often her own grandchildren or her nieces and nephews. Babblers compete very fiercely over reproduction, and if a subordinate female tries to lay eggs in the nest, then the dominant female will destroy those eggs. So there's a lot of behavioral competition in these societies over who's going to get to breed, and by and large, the dominant individuals normally win those competitions. In some species, though, we see something completely different. So we see helpers and dominant individuals developing along completely different developmental trajectories. So on this slide, you're seeing a queen ant. She's the very large individual, and you're seeing 3 smaller workers. Now, in this species, as in many social insect species, the workers are completely physiologically sterile. They simply can't breed. Even if the opportunity arises, they don't have the right apparatus physiologically to be able to breed. It might surprise you to learn that we also have physiologically sterile workers in our societies, but I don't advise you to call them this. Instead, we call them grandmothers. Grandmothers are an evolutionary puzzle. Why do human females switch off their ability to breed by undergoing a physiological menopause so long before they die? To convince you just how strange this situation is and just how anomalous, I'm going to show you a graph. On this figure, what you see is the average female lifespan in 52 different mammal species. Now, the only thing you have to really notice on this graph is that where the bar is green, that indicates the female's lifespan where she's still reproductively active. Any orange bit that's tacked onto the end is a period where the female is alive, but she's no longer able to breed. The only thing you really have to take away from this figure is that for the majority of the species in it, that line is completely green. What that means is that in most species, females continue to breed, or at least they try to, until they drop dead. However, on the graph, there are also a few outliers. So down here, that's us with our very long post-reproductive lifespan. And up here are a few species of toothed whales that are also known to undergo a physiological menopause. So menopause is unusual, but what causes it and why do we experience it? To think about this, take a look at this figure. So on this figure, you're seeing the number of follicles that a human female is born with and how that number changes throughout her lifespan. Follicles have the potential to develop into sex cells. So you can just think of follicles as being sex cells. They're produced by the ovary, and that's what allows a female to sustain regular menstrual cycles and also ultimately to be able to get pregnant and have children. So as human females are born with all the follicles they will ever have in situ, and the abundance of those follicles declines throughout the lifespan. Now, if the follicular attrition declined at a constant rate throughout our lives, we ought to be able to continue breeding until we're about 70. So if you just extrapolate that line down, you see that we do have enough of those follicles. We start with enough of them that we ought to be able to continue breeding until we're about 70 years old. But something really strange happens when a woman hits her late 30s. And at this point, you can see that that line, that decline in the follicles, seems to go off a bit of a cliff, and it goes into a much sharper rate of decline. And the consequence of this is that by the time a woman hits the age of about 50, she no longer has enough of these follicles left to sustain regular menstrual cycles. And then that's when you hit your menopause. So this explains the mechanics of menopause, tells us how it happens on a physiological basis, but it doesn't really explain why. Why do women undergo this sharp and non-linear decrease in the rate of follicular attrition? And why do we then experience this sharp transition from fertility to infertility? To understand why that happens, we have to take an evolutionary perspective. And we have to go way, way back to the periods that characterized human evolution and to think about the reproductive conflicts that might have played out during that time. So to the best of our knowledge, for ancestral human societies, dispersal was female biased. What that means is that when a woman reached reproductive age, when she reached reproductive maturity, she would leave her home, she would leave her natal group, and she would disperse, and she would move to live with the group or the family of her opposite sex partner. Let's just call him her husband for convenience. When a female disperses, this sets up a potential conflict between this younger female and her mother-in-law. And the conflict here is over who gets to breed. Now remember that I told you that humans evolved in very difficult environments. where we needed to work together to raise young. And a consequence of that is that if multiple females are breeding in the same household and are trying to raise young at the same time, then all the children will suffer. So there's a conflict between these two females about who's going to get to breed. But they're differentially related to one another's offspring. So the mother-in-law has a vested interest in any offspring that are produced by the younger female, because of course she's related to them via her son. They are her grandchildren. The younger female has no vested interest whatsoever in the offspring that might be produced by the mother-in-law. She is not related to the mother-in-law, and she therefore has no incentive to do anything that might help the mother-in-law's children from an evolutionary point of view. This is what's known as a relatedness asymmetry, and it weakens the mother-in-law's hand because she is slightly disincentivized to do anything that might harm her relatives, her grandchildren in this case, whereas the younger female doesn't face the same incentives. Over evolutionary time and over many, many generations, the outcome of this conflict resulted in the older female conceding in the battle over reproduction. She concedes by undergoing a physiological menopause, by agreeing, as it were, not to breed, and instead, she can still help copies of her genes find their way into subsequent generations by directing help to her grandchildren instead. What about this scene? Does this look familiar to you? Teaching is another thing that we think of as being quintessentially human. And it's something that we see in every human society and every culture on Earth, even if it doesn't always happen in formalized settings like this or in classrooms like the one on the screen. Even though it might not be obvious, teaching is also a form of cooperation because it involves a teacher going out of their way to help pupils learn something, to help them learn something that they might not otherwise be able to learn, or to learn something that would be very difficult to learn by yourself. Now, for a long time, it was thought that teaching relied on fairly sophisticated cognition. And for humans, it probably does involve this kind of cognition. It was thought that teaching relied on the ability to take the perspective of your pupil, to put yourself in their shoes, to understand what their beliefs are and their knowledge, and then to be able to take steps to remedy that. This is what psychologists call theory of mind, and it's something that we think is probably unique to humans. And for this reason, it was also thought that teaching was probably one of those things that would be unique to humans as well. Because if we don't see this kind of cognition in other species, then we shouldn't expect to see them teaching either. But we now know that that isn't the case. So if you were thinking as a researcher about looking for examples of teaching in a non-human species, your first port of call might be here. You might be very tempted to start with our closest living relatives, with the chimpanzees or maybe one of the other great apes. But in fact, there is no conclusive evidence at all for evidence of teaching in chimpanzees, in any of the great apes, and in fact, in any primate species whatsoever. What you see in this slide is a female chimpanzee using a stick to fish termites from a mound. And you see the youngster looking on very attentively. And this was a scenario that people did think might be a place where we would find teaching, where we would find the female going out of her way to help the youngster learn what to do. But it turns out that older chimps don't have to go out of their way to help the younger ones learn because the youngsters are really adept at learning through observation and copying. And so they don't need to be taught. And in fact, there are no very good examples of teaching in chimpanzees, or none that are very convincing. Instead, the three most convincing examples of teaching that we have to date from the non-human world, from the rest of the animal kingdom, came from meerkats, who attend a form of scorpion school, from pied babblers who use a form of Pavlovian conditioning to teach their young to associate a specific call with the arrival of food, and from tandem running ants who play a version of follow my leader that allows them to teach one another how to find interesting locations, like where food is or where a nest is. So, inspired by my children's love of these classic books, Choose Your Own Adventure, I would like you guys to now get your phones and to choose your own adventure and tell me which of these 3 teaching examples, Meerkat Scorpion School, Pavlov's Babblers, or Follow the Leader, would you like to know a bit more about? I just need to get to the Menti and make it go on to that. Okay. So if you go back to Menti, it's the same code. It's 72578535, and you should be able to select which one you'd like to hear about. Oh, there's no love for the ants. Sarian, vote for the ants. Oh, it's neck and neck with the meerkats and the babblers. Okay. Okay. I kind of want to do the meerkats because the video is good. Oh, the babblers are nudging it. Okay. All right. This is the part where it could go a bit wrong because I've got all the things lined up. But, okay. What? Can anyone see what it actually says? Is it babblers or meerkats? It's babblers. Okay. Oh, hang on. Okay, it's meerkats. Okay, it's meerkats. I'm calling it meerkats. All right. Am I back on my screen? Oops. Can you see? Oops. Right, okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to tell you about meerkats. I didn't rig that, I promise. I just do happen to have a better video for the meerkats. So meerkats teach their pups how to handle dangerous and potentially deadly prey items by giving pups opportunities to practice handling these prey items in a very safe manner. This is work that was done by my friend and colleague Alex Thornton and with Katie McAuliffe as well. And they found that meerkat helpers start by provisioning very young pups with dead prey. So when they first start provisioning pups with the prey, they just bring them dead prey items. When the pups get a bit older, they'll bring them items that have been chomped up a little bit. Maybe if they're a scorpion, they will have had the sting removed from the tail to render them less dangerous. And they'll give the pups the opportunity to practice handling maimed but kind of alive prey. And it's only when the pups are older still that the meerkats provision them with live, intact prey items. And by giving them these opportunities to practice handling these prey items in a relatively safe way, the meerkats give the pups opportunities to learn. Anyone who has ever had a house cat or has had experience of living with a cat might have found themselves being the same unwilling pupil in a similar sort of lesson, because this tendency that cats have to bring back half-dead prey items to the kitchen and leave them for you is also likely to be an expression of this same kind of teaching behaviour that we see in meerkats. So I'm going to show you a video on the next slide, and what you're going to see is a meerkat helper, first of all, chomping up a scorpion and removing the sting. And then you'll see a pup come along, and you'll see that the pup is a bit more incompetent at dealing with the prey item. And you should still see as well that the helper stays around and it watches how the pup's doing to make sure that the scorpion doesn't escape. So the pup doesn't really know what it's doing, but you can see the helper sort of watching on there and making sure the scorpion doesn't run off. So this is how meerkats teach their young, the young in the group, how to handle dangerous and potentially deadly prey items. I'm not going to show you this. You didn't vote for this. You didn't vote for this. Sorry. Okay, I didn't vote for that either. Sorry, babblers. Maybe next time. Okay, so what inferences can we draw here about the kind of cognition that is needed to support teaching? Well, one thing is for sure, none of the species that I've shown you, I didn't show you the babblers and the ants, but you'll have to take my word for it, none of these species are renowned for being particularly brainy. And there is no evidence whatsoever that any of them has theory of mind. They aren't able to take the perspective of another individual. They're not able to understand the knowledge state or the skill level of other individuals. But maybe they don't need to. Maybe you don't need this kind of cognition to be able to teach. And in fact, this highlights a more general point when it comes to thinking about comparisons between humans and non-humans when we're thinking about social behaviour. And the analogy that I think is helpful here is to think that when we're comparing the behaviour we see in humans and the behaviour we see in other species, we find that we often get to the same behavioural destination, but humans and other species quite often take different cognitive journeys to get there. So we get to the same place, but the cognitive journey we take to get there can be quite different. In the case of the meerkats, for example, the way that meerkats know how to adjust the lesson to the pup's skill level is that they simply use the begging calls of the pups as a guide. So just like human babies, a meerkat pup's begging call sounds different when it's very small compared to when it's a bit older and when it's older again. And proving that they are in fact not that brainy, if you play pups' begging calls through a speaker to meerkats, and you play the calls of very, very young pups, then meerkats will run over to the speaker and drop dead food items at the speaker. If you play the begging calls of older pups, then meerkats will run to the speaker and drop maimed or de-stinged specimens in front of the speaker. So it doesn't seem like there's much real sophisticated cognition going on here, but it's rather just a simple rule of thumb of if you sound like this, then this is the kind of prey item that I should give you. So far, we've talked a lot about cooperation within families, but humans are obviously different because we cooperate with non-relatives, and we even cooperate with complete strangers, with people we don't know, with people we might never even meet. And in this respect, we have rather a lot in common with this strange fish. This is Labroides dimidiatus, or the blue streak cleaner wrasse. And it's a small fish, about this big, and it lives throughout the Indo-Pacific on coral reefs. It holds small cleaning stations where it provides the service to the other fish that live on the reef. And the service involves removing ectoparasites from the surface of the client's skin. So all the other fish that live on the reef will visit these cleaning stations to have their ectoparasites removed. And of course, the cleaner gets a meal in return. I'm lucky to have worked on this system since 2010 with my colleague, Redwan Bashari. Now, this looks like a pretty harmonious situation. The clients come to the cleaning stations, they get their ectoparasites removed, and the cleaner gets a meal in return. So it seems like everything should be fine and happy here. But in fact, there's a conflict of interest between the cleaners and the clients. Because even though the cleaners will eat ectoparasites, what they prefer to eat and what they find more delicious is to eat the client's living tissues. So given the chance, the cleaners would prefer to eat mucus and scales. And this is obviously something that the clients don't want the cleaner fish to do. And so there's a conflict of interest, and it becomes a very interesting model system for asking how cooperation can be maintained when at least one party in the interaction, in this case the cleaner fish, is tempted to cheat. And it's interesting to ask how cooperation can be maintained here because they have no police. They can't sit down and talk about it and decide, you're not going to cheat me, you're going to give me a good service. There's no laws or contracts, and yet somehow in this system, cooperation is maintained, or at least a lot of the time it is. So I've worked on this system since 2010, And the first time I heard about it, I was at a conference and I was at a talk that was being given by Redwan Bashari. And I'd just come off the back of 4 field seasons in the desert. And I remember seeing Redwan put a slide up quite near the start of his talk that looked a bit like this. And this is the place where we do the fieldwork. It's called Lizard Island. It's in Australia. And I sat in that talk and I thought, it looks all right there. I reckon I could manage that. And so I went and found Redwan after the talk and in a sort of half-joking way mentioned that I wouldn't mind doing fieldwork at that location. Anyway, that chat went well and I booked some flights to Lizard Island and found my way there, fully expecting my field season to be something like this. But the reality was a little different. So here is what fieldwork on Lizard Island looks like. You spend 12-hour days cooped up in these quite small laboratories, smushing frozen prawn and fish goo onto plexiglass plates, which we use to perform behavioural experiments so that we can understand the decision rules that cleaner fish make. I'm not going to show you those experiments because I'd much rather show you how the cleaning behaviour looks on the reef, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next video. I think this is where we need sound, by the way, if we have it. I don't think that's the right sound. I don't know where that sound's come from. It's nice jazz. Okay, so I quite like the jazz. So you can see the cleaner fish swimming around, picking off parasites off all these fish that are visiting its cleaning station. Okay, so we know that there's this conflict between cleaners and clients. Clients want cleaner fish to remove ectoparasites. Cleaner fish want to eat mucus and scales. So what can the clients do about it? One of the tools that clients have up their sleeve is that they can punish cleaners who provide a bad service. They can punish them by aggressively chasing them. And when cleaners are punished in this way, they behave better next time. So I want to show you a video of how it looks when a client punishes a cleaner fish. So something obviously went wrong there and the cleaner fish got a telling off. And what we know from laboratory experiments is that when this happens, the cleaner fish will tend to eat more ectoparasites and do less biting, less cheating immediately after they've been punished. When I was working in the field and doing experiments with the cleaner fish, we also uncovered evidence for a different kind of punishment, a more subtle kind of punishment. And this is the punishment that occurs when an unaffected bystander intervenes to punish on behalf of a victim. In humans, we call this kind of punishment third-party punishment. And it was thought for a long time that this willingness to intervene in conflicts where you weren't directly harmed was a unique thing to humans, for starters, and was also something that allowed us to scale up cooperation on a large scale because it allowed us to enforce arbitrary norms of behaviour. However, in 2010, we found that cleaner fish were doing something remarkably similar. So I'm just going to talk you through the video because it all happens quite quickly in the video so that you can know what you're going to see. So what you're going to see here is a scenario where a male and a female cleaner fish work together to clean a joint client. So you can see on the clip already that there's 2 cleaner fish there, and they're going to clean the same client. Now, in this situation, if one of the cleaner fish cheats, if one of them bites the client has a high chance to swim away. And that means that only one of the cleaner fish can get a delicious bite of mucus, but both of the cleaner fish will pay the cost of client departure. And so there's a social dilemma here. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes or the fins of the client for a moment, you might expect to receive a really bad service when you're cleaned by 2 cleaner fish rather than by 1. Because if both the cleaner fish might be competing to bite you quicker than the other one, because both of them know that once you get bitten, you're going to swim away, then actually this is a social dilemma from the cleaner fish's point of view, and we might expect that the poor client receives a very bad service because of this. But in fact, what we see is completely the opposite. A client that's cleaned by 2 cleaner fish instead of 1 gets a much better service. It gets more ectoparasite removal and fewer bites. And all of that improvement in service quality comes from the female cleaner fish. And in the video, you will see why the female cleaner fish toes the line. So what you're going to see is both fish cleaning, and then at some point, the client will jolt. It visibly shakes. And then once that's happened, that jolt is a sign that it's been bitten. And once that happens, look at how the male cleaner fish responds. That's the jolt. Okay, so that's the male cleaner fish giving the female a really hard time after the client has been cheated. So it wasn't the male that got bitten, it was the client who got bitten, and yet the male is intervening in some ways on behalf of this victim to force the female to toe the line. I always get asked whether the female cleaner fish ever punishes the male, and the answer is that no, she doesn't. Female cleaner fish are smaller than males, they're subordinate to males, and they never aggressively punish their male partners. And in some ways, the males are a bit hypocritical because they often punish the females even when they were the one who did something wrong. And perhaps for this reason, our cleaner fish received some rather unfavourable comparisons with other irascible individuals that you might have heard of. So, punishment is important in cleaner fish, and it's obviously also important in our own societies as well. I'm just going to give you one example of punishment in humans. This is an image of Turkana men, and they're about to go on a raid. So the Turkana are a tribal society from rural Kenya, and men sometimes participate in raids on neighbouring groups, where the aim is to steal cattle and also sometimes to steal women, and to bring whatever they can steal back to the group. Now, it might not sound very cooperative, but going on one of these raids is a form of cooperation. It is a public good in a way, because any stolen resources that are appropriated are brought back to the group and are shared with everybody. And going on the raid is obviously costly and dangerous and potentially even fatal nowadays, especially because raids nowadays are fought with guns and not just with spears. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there is a reasonably high temptation to defect in this situation. Men are sometimes tempted to abandon the raid and to return to the safety of the camp. And when they do this, they're liable to be punished by their same age peer mates. And punishment in this society takes the form of being tied to a tree and being beaten really quite brutally by your same age peer mates. And so this is just one example of how punishment is used to enforce a certain standard of behaviour in human societies. Another reason that humans are so cooperative, even in scenarios where we're not interacting with relatives, is because there are often reputation benefits to be gained from cooperating. People do typically behave as if they're aware that their reputation is valuable. We know this from countless experiments, both in the lab and in the field. People are more likely to behave generously when they believe that these deeds will be made known to other people, compared to when any good deeds go unseen. Now, one important thing to note here is that I'm not suggesting that the only reason people cooperate or that they help others is because they are thinking about these reputation benefits, or that all helpful acts are performed in a calculated manner. That's just not how these things work. So quite often, the psychological reason we do things and the evolutionary reason that those behaviours have been selected for can be completely separate, and we can be completely unaware on a psychological level of any evolutionary benefits of the behaviour. To give just another example to make that clearer, if we think about sex and why people have sex, it's clear that the evolutionary function is to increase reproductive success. But no one would ever assert that every time people have sex that this is done in a calculated manner to increase, to make a baby or to increase reproductive success. And helping behaviour is just the same. The evolutionary impetus and the psychological drive can often be quite distinct from one another. So, helping is a costly signal. It's nature's way of revealing information. And the most famous costly signal in nature is, of course, the peacock's tail. In fact, it's so ostentatious that in this lovely picture I found earlier, it's actually very difficult to see the female if you don't look for her. So in this system, this broadcast signal, this costly signal, is borne by the male, and it's the male who stands to benefit from sending this signal. And he benefits through females being attracted to him and through a consequent increase in reproductive success. Now, humans don't go to such great lengths as peacocks, and the sex differences aren't as pronounced. But there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that ostentatious displays like this are more common among men than they are among women. I'm going to show you some pictures now, and I'd just like to say that if there's anyone either here or at home who is a bit squeamish, it might be a good moment to look away because some of the pictures are a little bit gnarly. So I'm going to show you two pictures here of men engaging in costly displays of ritual devotion. And men who undertake these kinds of displays stand to benefit in terms of their prestige and their status. I'm also going to show you a picture of a typical kind of signal in a similar setting that women might perform, a much subtler display of devotion. Now, for both men and women, sending signals like this can translate into tangible benefits. It can translate into improved social position, increased fertility, attractiveness to partners, and increased survival of offspring through social capital that can be generated from gaining prestige and status. And inspired by these findings, I was interested in looking for evidence of these kinds of broadcast signaling in the helping domain in humans. And I looked for this using online fundraising pages. And specifically, I used all the fundraising pages that were set up for the 2014 London Marathon. Now, for people who might not know, these fundraising pages are used most often when people are going to do an event and they want to raise money for charity. So they often will be doing a marathon or something like that. And they want to raise money for charity, and so they'll set up a page on a website like Just Giving, and then they'll ask everyone in their social network to visit that page and to donate to the charity of their choice. These fundraising pages are a really good place to look for evidence of costly helping behaviour, and in particular to look for evidence of competitive signalling, because donations that arrive on a page are both visible and sequential, meaning that donors can see and respond to what people have given previously. So the first question we were interested in was whether people care. Do they even look at what other people have given, and do they respond to it? And it turns out that they do. So the average donation size on a page like this is about £20. But every now and then someone will come along and they'll leave what we call a large donation of at least £50 or twice the average for that page. Now the question is, what happens when the next people arrive on the fundraising page? Do they up their ante in response to seeing this large donation? And it turns out that they do. After a large donation arrives on a fundraising page, the donors give around £10 more on average each. So this is all well and good, But we were also interested in whether we might be able to see evidence of competitive signalling, and specifically of men getting into generosity tournaments on these web pages. And so what we looked at was what happens when a large donation arrives on one of these pages, but the large donation has been made by a man. And in particular, when these large donations are being made on the pages of attractive female fundraisers. What happens in this situation is that when men arrive, the next men to arrive on the page after this large donation has been made tend to give, on average, about £35 more, not just £10 more. And we didn't detect any evidence of this kind of competitive signalling among women. So it seems like men are getting into some kind of generosity competitions or using these pages as a means to broadcast something about themselves. We didn't find evidence for that among women. And this is a phenomenon that had been shown already in the lab, but not in a real-world setting. And so this is a kind of real-world demonstration of this peacocking, if you like, among men. It turns out that cleaner fish also show off to an audience. So when a cleaner fish is cleaning a client, sometimes what can happen is that it's being watched by other clients nearby. And the other clients are watching because they're waiting their turn. They're waiting to be cleaned by the cleaner fish. When the clients are watching what's going on, if they see the current interaction ending badly, if they see the current client either chasing the cleaner fish or swimming away very quickly, which is an indicator that it's been bitten, then sometimes everyone else who's waiting in the queue will swim off and find a new cleaning station instead. And amazingly, the cleaner fish are sensitive to when they're being watched by an audience, and they provide a better service to their current client when there's an audience watching them. This is another example where we see evidence of this same behavioral destination, different cognitive journey kind of metaphor. We don't think that cleaner fish are able to take the client's perspective or to understand how a client's impression of them might have changed based on whether they bit the current client or not. There's no evidence for this kind of cognition in cleaners. Instead, cleaner fish just learn that if I bite this client, all those other ones swim away, and I can learn not to do that again next time. So they can just learn this rule very simply through trial and error, and there's no evidence really for any sophisticated cognition that is used in reputation management in humans. In this final part of the talk, I want to just turn towards some of the societal implications of this research on cooperation. And in particular, the idea that cooperation is not a panacea for the global problems that we face, because cooperation can sometimes have victims. Here's a really nice story that I read about a couple of years ago. It involves Uber drivers and Lyft drivers arriving at international airports, waiting for the passengers to come off the plane, and then turning off the app that indicates their availability. Then they wait. At some point, surge pricing will kick in, at which point the Uber drivers and the Lyft drivers will switch back on the app that indicates their availability and take passengers who will pay just a little bit more to be journeyed home to their destination. Gouging your customers in this way doesn't sound particularly cooperative. But of course, this is a form of cooperation. The drivers have to cooperate with one another to generate the surge pricing, and by switching off the app, they're running the risk of missing out on a fare altogether. This is cooperation that just so happens to have victims. It happens to be to the passenger's cost. Sometimes we can see the similar kind of victims of cooperation happening inside our own bodies, when sometimes some of the cells inside our bodies decide to pursue their own interests, and they collaborate and work together to thwart the host defenses and to divert resources to themselves. And when this happens, we call the disease that results from it cancer. Nepotism, corruption, cronyism. They aren't really words that we think of as being associated with cooperation. But again, these are all examples of cooperation that are occurring at local scales, but which have wider costs. The key point here is that large-scale cooperation is always vulnerable to being undermined by cooperation at lower layers. And so we come to see cooperation as a bit of a double-edged sword. Cooperation is clearly the reason for our ecological dominance, for our extraordinary ecological success. And yet it's also the reason that we've managed to overpopulate the planet. And it's the reason why we are overusing all of its ecological resources. It's also behind many of the most pressing and urgent problems we face. These are all problems of failed cooperation. I'm not going to stand here now and pretend that I have the answer to these kinds of problems, but they clearly pose an urgent question. How can we all cooperate more and cooperate to generate global and not just local benefits? And it's worth pointing out that our species has tackled problems on this scale before. And I think we can succeed, but there are also plenty of examples of where we've failed. So even though I believe we can resolve problems like this, I don't think it's a given that we will. You can see from these pictures how varied my investigation has had to be to understand the social instinct. However, as with any complicated topic, there are always going to be a few hard decisions. And there were some things that I had to leave out. For example, I didn't get to tell you how these guys invented their own form of democracy. I didn't get to tell you how our social worlds sometimes make us suspicious and even paranoid. I didn't get to tell you about why we sometimes dislike do-gooders and disparage them rather than applauding them for their good deeds. And I didn't get to tell you why chimpanzees would never use Facebook. All these stories are part of the big landscape of cooperation, and they're all part of my book. So if you would like to know more and you are interested to dig a little deeper, here it is. And I really hope that you enjoy it. Thank you so much for your attention.